So I would like to welcome everybody. Good evening and welcome to UBC's Master of Educational Technology Anti-Racism Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Carrie Ewert, and I am a coordinator for EDI and the community outreach, as well as a faculty member for the Master of Educational Technology program, what we call MET at UBC. And one of the designers and coordinators for this particular speaker series, along with our very amazing faculty member, Dr. Samia Khan, who is a member of Curriculum and Pedagogy and last year's director of MET. And we thank all of you and those who are repeat attenders for the series, as well as new attenders for joining us here today. Before we continue, I'm just going to advance the next slide. There we go. I, as an uninvited settler and non-Indigenous person, I would truly like to acknowledge that I recognize that I work and teach, and we meet here today on UBC's lens on this unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And I acknowledge that our traditional hosts and honor their welcome and graciousness to the people who seek this knowledge. I, as an ally and an uninvited ally, but really working to become an ally to this work, I'm consistently learning and relearning and unlearning throughout my practice. And I'm committed to this ongoing research, as well as self-education about Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing, and decolonizing my practice. So I recognize that the profession of education has profound roots in colonial violence, and acknowledge my responsibility as the coordinator for EDI and community outreach, as well as a graduate student educational practitioner, to meaningfully engage in the ongoing process in disrupting Eurocentric, hegemonic, and colonialist norms. So especially looking at these systems and structures by demonstrating the values and the ways of Indigenous education and decolonizing and anti-racism, specifically by combating these systemic issues and looking at our Indigenous people's values and ways of life. So this takes time. It takes learning, it takes effort, and it really is a means that we have to move past the talk and not speak of this in lieu of action. So this anti-racism speaker series is just for that purpose, to move the talk to action and really move into the process of truth and reconciliation. So I thank everybody for being here today and honoring our Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing. Now, as the MET program, it is the Master of Educational Technology. It is a graduate program at UBC in the Faculty of Education, and it educates professionals on and the use and impact of digital learning technologies. So the purpose of this series really is to address and acknowledge the commitment that every individual has to inclusivity and to addressing systemic racism, with the focus on anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-people of color racism. This series seeks to identify the responsibility that educators and leaders from around the world have to facilitating and supporting anti-racist approaches, and to enhance the strategies for truth, redress, and reconciliation within their practice, and enhance that transformative learning practice and learning environment and within learning cultures. So with the specific directive being digital technologies, presenters will discuss racism and tools to support equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization, and anti-racism, and changing that dynamic, that status quo in this digital age. So we look at what's different about this series, and that is the call to action. It's a challenge for you, again, to move past just the talk, just the content, the presentation, into action. So we are going to speak to this a little bit more after the presentation, but I do not want to take any of Sheliza's time. And this is Dr. Sheliza Ibrahim. I'm going to just stop sharing and pin so that you have our presenter at the forefront of everything. And looking, it is my absolute great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Sheliza Ibrahim, who is an assistant professor with the University of Toronto in the Institute for the Study of University Pedagogy. She has taught and conducted research in the field of mathematics, education, and science education, examining pedagogical approaches that support traditional, sorry, I have a page that I'm reading because she does so much great work and I don't want to leave it out. Ecological knowledge, inhabiting place, and critical awareness of the nature of science and mathematics. So currently, her research focuses on higher education and the design of socially just practices in the field of numeracy and other STEM fields, and conducts various international research projects across the Caribbean with a focus on university pedagogy. She also works in partnership with the Faculty of Medicine at UTM to support student achievement. And I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Sheliza Ibrahim, who will share some pedagogical ideas for teaching social justice, ecojustice, and anti-racism within STEM context through utilizing equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist educational technology tools. Dr. Ibrahim will specifically share examples from a first-year undergraduate course called Critical Thinking for STEM Learning to explore her pedagogical decisions and their outcomes. So a very, very warm welcome to you, Dr. Sheliza Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that beautiful introduction too. I'm always reminded how much we've done and how far this academic work can take us. So it's inspiring to be here and to be with our audience members as well, just to kind of talk about learning and teaching and these sort of pedagogical reframing that happens throughout this space. Before I begin, I hope that everyone can see my screen and it's looking like only the screen. I mean, only my slide and not my notes.
You're perfect.
Hopefully thumbs up on that. Perfect. I also want to just say I begin this talk with this title called A Just World, Reimagining an Anti-Racist Pedagogy for STEM Futures. But I come with it knowing that I am an evolving practitioner in this work. So I'm sharing ideas, but I know that, it sounds like I've found this sort of magic, possibility in terms of a pedagogical way of approaching anti-racist education, but it's hard, for sure not the case. It's an evolving practice for me, and I'm constantly learning. And I'm also very cognizant of being in conversation with the community groups that I am teaching and working with to make sure that I am kind of moving through this space in a way that's honorable and has integrity as well. So, and I make mistakes along the way, but as Dr. Ewert mentioned, sort of this hopefully invited ally, that I don't want to not leave this work in fear of not doing it well. I kind of want to continue doing the work in hopes that, I just get better at that practice. So I begin by acknowledging the land that I'm a settler on, because I'm actually connecting with you from Ontario. And my parents immigrated here in the 1970s. They met here, and I was born actually in Mississauga, Ontario. And I recognize the shared histories tied to the colonial realities of my ancestors, as my parents are from the Caribbean. And that really guides my relationship to Canada as well. This specific land we gather on is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, including the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. And their stories, beliefs, and concepts about the land and our interactions with it continue to guide and inspire me and my work. And I hope to acknowledge the individual histories and knowledge that every person sharing in this space will bring as well, while honoring the original keepers. And as you kind of are guided through this work, you'll probably think about your own identity and positionality within this space too. I want to begin just kind of addressing, how I got here and why teaching has become this sort of very important part of my practice, aside from my research. And education as being a place of hope for me. I know that I teach science and mathematics education and also concepts of cognition and learning in higher education. But within these conversations, I'm always weaving in culturally responsive ideas. The nature of science and the nature of mathematics and the social construction of knowledge that exists within those spaces is very much an important part of how I address the work that I do, including the diversity of voices that are needed to solve many of our problems in the world so that my students feel empowered to bring their whole identities to the conversations, the ideas, the problems that they're contemplating in this academic space, and hopefully, beyond and into their, future professional careers as well. I remember a student from a science education course I was teaching had left me a course evaluation class in my course telling me to stick to the science concepts and leave the social justice connections out. Just a very brief comment. And ever since then, I've been actually even more transparent about why these concepts and knowledge systems and ideas of knowing are important. And it was in that moment that I realized how easy epistemologies from different cultures were easily erased by dominant cultures. And so I try to share those epistemologies from these different traditions and ways of knowing in the science and mathematics classroom so that they're not further erased as well. So in doing that, teaching is actually my form of activism. It's a place for me to open up critical discourse on science or technology and math. And it also allows me to talk about social, environmental, and historical implications. And I see it as a form of my own activism because I see education as this beautiful place for hope. And I know that education was built in institutionalized frameworks that unethically position power and knowledge structures in very particular ways. So I know that decolonization of education can allow us to be very hopeful in this space and empower us to make pedagogical decisions that are just, very good, and just good work, really. So I'm going to begin by speaking a little bit about, I guess, the definitions that I've found useful. Firstly, anti-racism as this active and consistent process of change to eliminate individual, institutional, and systemic racism. And secondly, a definition of anti-racist education, which is based in the notion of race and racial discrimination as being embedded within the policies and practices of institutional structures. Its goal is to aid students to understand the nature and characteristics of these discriminatory barriers and to help work to dismantle them. So building a society that is free of racism requires ongoing commitment. And racism and discrimination can exist in all parts of our lives in Canada. And from, as noted in these definitions, systemic and unconscious biases as well that influence even how we relate to one another. So when I look at anti-racist education, I'm really trying to just bring awareness, and hopefully that will allow these barriers to be dismantled. So I begin by really coming back to a pedagogical idea that I've been implemented in my own courses year after year after year, to be honest. And it looks different every time. And it's grounded in some theoretical work that I had done about over a decade ago. And the idea of it was to kind of address how I might approach teaching. And the approach that emerged was a model called critical place-based science education. And the approach considers both critical pedagogy and place-based education as theoretical frameworks. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. But I just wanted to position the way that we approach teaching. And even for me as an early in my teaching practice, I would think about myself as an educator and, what are the ways that I feel comfortable teaching? I would think about the curriculum or the content that I needed to teach. And then I would think about the institution, like maybe the context that I'm in, maybe the rules and regulations that might constrain where I might go, maybe outside the classroom. Those kinds of decisions are quite important. But I was also thinking about teaching from the perspective or the worldview of the learner and the learner's environment and place, and also the relationships and societal interactions that they have within community, and how to balance both of them. Because as an educator, you are kind of thinking about curriculum and institutionalized regulations. And at the same time, you're thinking about the learner, the place that you're working in, and the society that your teaching is embedded in as well. So I kind of have been shaping my teaching around how I might bridge these two worldviews together. And I've taught biology education, science education, environmental education. And I also teach a lot of interdisciplinary courses, such as STEM, but also science and social studies intersections. And one of the pedagogical activities that I do in my course is something that has been evolving through this research over the last 10 years as well. And I want to kind of come back to this idea of place first, because I think it kind of grounds how this approach has lended itself within this framing. So first off, place-based education is a scholarship in an area that's helped me navigate the ways in which we reclaim places through our interactions with land. And that reclamation is an act of decolonization as we connect to the land through the lens of the first peoples, or from our own making, not from the prescribed ways of knowing the land through the lens of settlers. So even just taking a walk can kind of reintroduce this land in a different way. Critical pedagogy provides a theoretical framework to examine issues of power in the classroom and to surface and challenge the biases and oppressive structures that can undermine learning and alienate students. Inclusive teaching offers strategies for translating that theoretical knowledge into action. So political and social and educational systems tend to reflect this more dominant culture. Over time, values, behaviors, beliefs associated with that culture become so integrated, it becomes invisible. And those living within the dominant culture do not recognize it as a system, but simply as normal. And anything outside of the system is that sort of other. Case in point, that one student that I had that couldn't see because it was so invisible that those types of important ideas around science, such as gender in science or traditional ecological knowledge, those things had become invisible to that person. Some educational theorists recognize that these differences, have a profound impact on education. Bordeaux and Freire's work, which I draw on for critical pedagogy's theoretical framing, they saw that traditional educational systems tended to reflect and favor the experiences of children from the dominant communities. And because these children understood that system and saw themselves reflected in it, they thrived and they were successful, while children from historically marginalized communities had different kind of obstacles and barriers to navigate through their education. Since the dominant systems are essentially invisible, those in power tend to attribute the challenges faced by marginal individuals as inherent to the person and not recognizing that it's actually systemic. So bridging this critical pedagogy idea in this place was beautifully done actually in Greenwald's work. And if you haven't read this piece, it's called The Best of Both Worlds, A Critical Pedagogy of Place, then add it to your list of readings. It draws on a variety of critical discourses on critical pedagogy in place. And the research asserts that it promotes ecological thinking as well as critical social analysis. And I just want to share this excerpt in case you don't get to read this article. But it has shaped some of the pedagogical tools that I have used. So Grinwald writes, being in a situation has a spatial, geographical, contextual dimension. Reflecting on one situation corresponds to reflecting on the space that one inhabits. Acting on one situation often corresponds to changing one's relationship to a place. Freire asserts that acting on one's situationality, what I will call decolonization and reinhabitation, makes one more human. It is in this spatial dimension of situationality and its attention to social transformation that connects critical pedagogy with the pedagogy of place. And both discourses are concerned with the contextual geographical conditions that shape people and the actions that people take to now reshape those conditions. So the purpose of critical pedagogy is to engage learners in the act of what Freire calls conscientizazo, which has been defined as place-based pedagogies that are needed so that the education of citizens might have some direct bearing on the well-being of social and ecological places that people actually inhabit. So the first activity I do, which is framed in this theoretical framing and sort of those worldviews that I mentioned, is a critical visualizing activity. And I actually use images that I gather from sources on the internet. So that's one educational tool that I use quite a lot, is kind of sourcing these images that are sort of provoking, but also at the same time drawing an interest and a conversation around science, around environmental issues. And the term that's used, coined by Ziegler's work, is socio-scientific issues. So I'll put a range of images around, and I'll ask students to comment on them. How do you feel when you look at this image? How might it relate to your community? And what STEM connections do you see within it? Or maybe socio-scientific connections, or maybe I might say science or math. Like I said, I teach so many different courses, so I'll usually cater it to that class. So I'm trying to reimagine an anti-racist pedagogy that, allows students to first think and enter in sort of a very critical way. So in the beginning, I did this activity with students, and I would paste these images, you can see them here, and give them Post-it notes, and they'd walk around the classroom and they would make comments. And so those images were captured through sort of an online source. And this was in 2008. And recently I did it again as well with another student. But in my course right now, I'm in an active learning classroom, which is pretty impressive because every pod, like every group, is sitting in front of their own whiteboard, but it's also projecting my image. So, I'd have my image. This is my center console, and I can see it in the center of the classroom. So that's the center of the classroom. And then they're kind of positioned all around. And so I have positioned those pictures around, and then they actually use dry erase to write on the whiteboard, or they can also use the active learning marker that's associated with that smartboard. And they can write, and then they can make comments about those images that way as well. So the active learning classroom has been a beautiful educational tool to kind of transform the way that I've used this activity over time. I feel like I'm aging myself through sort of the lens of technology changing, but this has been quite powerful. And also I'm allowed to get students to do gallery walks. So then they also walk around and see what are some of the inquiry and investigations and wonderments that students have had about some of these images as well. So some of the images I've gathered have been some of Ed Vertinsky's work. This work looks at, I share these images without sharing any information. So it's kind of interesting to see what they say about them and their connection to them. What does it feel like, that affective domain? And then those kind of connections to environment and society and sustainable measures come through as well. But then, of course, afterwards I share where they're from. So this is a shipwreck along the shorelines of Bangladesh, and this is actually sort of a tire yard in California. And it's interesting to kind of see how students comment about these kinds of images. Some of the younger students assume that rubber will disintegrate. They make comments like that, like maybe it will disappear somehow. So there's also misconceptions that are learned through this process as well. I've also shared images from a website, and actually it's also a book as well, called The Hungry Planet. And this is the Abu Bakr family from Darfur, Sudan. And they're located in Chad. This is the Bayton family from Wiltshire in the UK, down here. And then this is the Ravis family from North Carolina, a family in the United States. And again, the kinds of comments that students have to kind of like critically explore these images is about food production, locally grown food, packaging, waste. A lot of conversations come from that, but also students who identify with these spaces, like people who have traveled or refugees or immigrants that are now in our schools. They actually talk about that food, like the food that's there. Like I remember a student explaining to other students how to make rice, like, boiling it in a cup of, boiling a cup, and it becomes like 4 cups because it expands. So also kind of sharing that, there's actually quite an abundance where it might not seem like there is quite an abundance in these spaces. And this is actually, these images are sharing 1 week's worth of groceries for each family member. I also look at images that are present as well. Like some of those images are from sort of, maybe decades old, but I look at some more current events. These images are from the BBC website, and it was on the recent, well, this was from 2021, but it was from the recent climate change disasters that are happening throughout the world. And this was in the Caribbean. So conversations around ecojustice, and particularly geographical ecojustice, is shown here, where this particular place is looking at how scientists have shown that the warmer that the earth has become has caused flooding, has caused other kinds of natural disasters, greater gas emissions, and it's sort of actually causing these atmospheric problems to occur. So Caribbean island countries say that their adaptation plans are not effective when a hurricane comes through because they're even more powerful due to these climatic changes. And low-income countries are struggling to protect themselves against climate change as well. And we, of course, have to think of this as a global condition. And those are some of the conversations that come out because of the ways in which we might provide help. But also, we recognize that these sort of moments are happening very close to home as well. This is in Abbotsford, BC, and this was about the record rains that brought an atmospheric river last November that washed out major highways, railways, and forced thousands to flee. So a lot of these images, these ones are from CBC Radio. And then this last set of images are from the University Times website. So I shared these images because I was working with a very special cohort of students that was taking my critical thinking for STEM students. They were 22 Black identified students. So I also tried to choose images that would represent maybe some of the things that they might be thinking about at the time. And these students were pre-university. So we were having conversations about how much does university cost, and sort of those financial conversations about financial literacy and financial matters in order to figure out, well, what is the price of university costs? So these images showed or invited a discussion on, first of all, the idea that education should not be a privilege, that it should be a right of all, but also bring awareness to other kinds of counterclaims to these issues, such as relational thinking to very particular countries. For example, in Africa, they were talking about how higher education should actually demand fair funding models and fair payment systems, because in order to have education, they could actually provide more provisions to their community and to their world, to their country as well. So there's those kinds of conversations as well. So all these images are brought that are intentional, and they're also meant to kind of invite these non-invasive conversations for students to connect with what's happening in these spaces and to bridge the sort of gap between education or these academic spaces or these places of elitism to different conversations about climate change, ecojustice, but also global and health issues as well. I further this activity by asking students to kind of be an agent and, think about their agency. And so I ask them, okay, now that we've looked at these images critically through sort of a global lens, let's take a look at our local neighborhoods and let's make note of the socio-scientific issue connections that you see in the take it for granted of your place. And they go through their community and they spend a few minutes sort of writing down the thing that they notice about their community, and then they take photographs. So they're using cameras, they're using even their phones. Some of them are actually making short video clips, and I've actually had students also share that through YouTube videos and even making Instagram accounts where they're posting photos, and then students and actually the broader community are able to comment on it. It's very similar to the way that they commented to those other pictures. They can now comment to those pictures of their own. So this neighborhood follows an instructional strategy that suggests that learning from one's place is engaging and meaningful as well. And place-based education also, acts as that reclamation of these personal sites of home and society and environment, and connects our students to that place. I then asked them to kind of take this community walk with a new lens. So they are not looking at it from sort of the everyday space, but looking at it from this ecological mindset, from an anti-racist or social justice mindset, and to be critical thinkers. So they're taking photos, making these short clips, and I'm also inviting them to not be, too curated when they take these images, but to just allow themselves to take these images, to just document it all, and then see how it affects them, how they feel, what are they witnessing or seeing, and does it kind of drive maybe their impetus to actually have a solution or do some sort of activism work around it. So because I asked them to share, collect everything, I also don't want them I do not want them to feel that for this activity, they have to share it all. For example, one time I did this activity and a student took a photo of their younger sister in the hospital undergoing surgery, and she chose not to share it. So for those sort of more intimate pictures or photos, I want them to, make those decisions on their own. But I'm inviting them to do that because I want students to actually have a learning experience more than doing the activity because it's an assessment tool and, I'm getting them to do it as part of my course. I just want them to have their own process of capturing that, maybe investigating it, researching it more, diving more deeply. Sometimes there's a healing journey that comes through that. Sometimes there's a learning journey that comes through that, or an unlearning journey that comes through that. And maybe it isn't something that they are welcome to share, but they had that. And that to me is more important. I also use YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. So I also do neighborhood walks, and I invite them to do that as well. So this is just me. I posted this on my own YouTube of me doing a neighborhood walk by the escarpment where I live. It's called Rattlesnake Point. And I was talking about the watersheds that are actually designed to catch the rain and snow because of all the urbanization that's happened in that community as well. So these sort of urban and ecological decisions are very much intertwined. So I also use YouTube to kind of document my own journey, and I invite them to use those kinds of tools as well. Then, of course, they go on that walk throughout the university campus. And every time I do this activity, I always return to place, because an activity that adopts place-based education is just reimagined every single time. And it's because these students are in a new community or a new context. It's just different every single time. And also, the moment is different. The history is different. I mean, doing this activity during the pandemic was completely different, and trying to do it through an online space. So those kinds of moments of doing this activity throughout time has been quite engaging, but also recognizing the sort of tools and educational tools that I've been able to use as well. So now I've invited my students to actually share it in our learning management system. When they share it on the learning management system, I get them, of course, I tell them to post one photo. They don't have to post all of the ones that they've done. And they do sometimes submit the full gamut, but when they submitted there, students are able to actually follow the thread, and they can comment on those photos as well. And I wanted to create a learning experience for them. So whether they decided to choose to, post something on a discussion board or a blog to, share with their collective, it was just their choice. And if they decided not to share it, the learning experience is still very rich for them, because they can investigate it, they can unpack that socioscientific issue with a degree of personal reference. And oftentimes their positionality within the work that they're doing really shines, and they start to bring, conversations that are, for instance, with my Black student youth, that were embedded in anti-Black racism. And they talked about futures for Black students. They talked about the impact of certain health issues, even the pandemic, on Black communities. So it was very, very connected to their own positionality, and that was very enriching. Sometimes it touched on social issues that are systemic and discriminatory. And I recognize that they might not want to draw attention to those moments in an undergraduate course with people that they don't really know yet. So you're also building community and fostering that community. And I found that using like an LMS, like a learning management system, can sometimes allow students to be a little bit more open than in that sort of, classroom personal space as well. So that has been a very powerful way of non-evasively getting them to share without kind of, being too evasive with that. I'm going to also add that in the active learning classrooms, they were also able to just share within their groups their photos and discuss with each other. And they posed I wonder statements to further and deepen their inquiry. And what was pretty quite normal, actually, is that sometimes students work together in a group, and you'll get like very similar images. And sometimes students aren't, and you just kind of get maybe an environmental issue that's just very prevalent in their community, right? So you get the same images across the board. But because they have different lenses, different positionality, a different identity, I get very different like captions, very different descriptions and connections that they make for the exact same moment or the exact same place. And that's been pretty an opener for a lot of conversations and collaborative learning that happens as well. And when they actually kind of take on one of these issues and they recognize, hey, I actually saw that as well, and that was a very interesting, issue that's happening in our community, then they actually kind of form a group together, and then they actually form a collective, work that's towards some sort of action or agency as well. And that has been quite important to me to see where this work moves towards activism. So to extend this work, I asked students to choose a photo or identify a community issue that or STEM topic, like a socio-scientific issue, and to problematize solutions. And I encourage them to research those topics, but examining literature so that their claims and arguments are informed, not opinion-based. So I'm also teaching them how to do research. I plant sort of that seed of action where they might identify actionable steps to reducing harm or creating a product that is sustainable, or covering a truth towards reconciliation, or mobilizing knowledge or awareness. And this critical pedagogy Venn diagram kind of captures the importance of social justice within the critical pedagogy framework, and how agency and power and privilege are interconnected with social justice, and that they're important underlying concepts for social justice education as well. So specifically, the student agency involves giving to students choice in their own learning. And then the social justice is the idea of acting with equality, fairness, and dignity for all humans. And then the power and privilege involves our evolving and reflecting understanding of what position we truly inhabit in the classroom as we're sharing these ideas, because some students have contradicting ideas as well. And I want to just, I guess, close so we can open the conversation, but I often contemplate my time as an educator in higher ed and university pedagogy and consider it as education as the practice of freedom. It's a statement from bell hooks that originates from Paulo Freire, which I quoted earlier, but where education as a practice of freedom will come easiest to those of us who believe that our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. And that sort of transgressive and disruptive thinking, therefore, begins with the soul and not the prospective career opportunities of students. And I'm reminded, too, that I attended an Indigenous Leadership and Business Congress last year, September. And one of the panelists spoke about their experience as a child taken to attend a Christian school, a Christian residential school. And she specifically said the school's purpose was to remove their ability to be critical thinkers. So I'm very conscious that we are in a place of institutionalized schooling that where we need to now come back and give them the ability and teach them the ability to be critical thinkers. And I absolutely love James Baldwin, who, I leave this talk to teachers quote with you as well. And I'm ongoing doing this work. I also like to talk to students about, I guess this is really actually Bruno Latour's work on actor network mapping, but I like to talk to them about how complex ideas are. So when they do send a photograph of a community problem or a socio-scientific issue or an eco-justice issue, I ask them to think about the stakeholders, the community members, the themselves, the education systems, the products, all of the complex things that are influencing the way in which that reacts and interacts within society. And it's living and non-living, right? So it impacts environment and nature as well. And so when they start to make those connections, I think that's quite useful in thinking about how to reframe this work. And so if anyone's interested in that work, I have an article on that talks about actor network mapping, but particularly looks at how we might prioritize social justice and ecological sustainability in STEAM education as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time to share my work, and I'm open for any questions. And this is how you can reach me if you'd like to stay connected.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. That was amazing, filled with so many ideas and strategies. And, the whole time I'm thinking, I want to do this with my students every single time. So we've opened up a Slido for questions, but I also see that we have a hand up as well from Joanna, and who asks, could you kindly share your article title in full? And so what we'll do is actually everybody will have a copy of this. It will be going up on the website, on the Met website under anti-racism. And what we'll also do is, if it's okay with you, Dr. Ibrahim, that we'll post your article there as well.
Oh, yeah. I'll add it to the chat too.
Perfect.
I can find the chat.
And I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Khan right now, who can run the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ewert, and I'm very pleased to present several questions from our audience through the Slido, and they've been upvoted. So I'll start with the first question to you, Dr. Ibrahim. You gave us so many different tools and pedagogical strategies to consider. And so many of us are on a different journey with regards to critical pedagogy. What recommendations would you give to effectively implement critical pedagogy in place-based education when I'm just starting to unlearn and relearn?
That's a very good question. And to be honest, it really is a journey. So as you're sort of moving through this space, you will continuously grow in the way in which you can implement this work. I have found that that article I shared with you, The Best of Both Worlds, has been a very important framing to combine critical pedagogy in place in terms of a framework that is connected. I do also recognize that place-based education has its own space, mostly in environmental ed. And then critical pedagogy has its own space, mostly in oppressive work, anti-oppressive work, anti-racist work as well. So kind of bringing those two together, I think is a quite powerful way of kind of reframing and thinking about that knowledge. So I would recommend starting with that article. I would also say that when you're in your, when you're in your teaching practice, whether it's in whether it's elementary, high school, or university, that one of the things that I've done is I've also connected with the community learning groups that exist within the universities. So for instance, in North Bay, I worked with the Baldwin group. They were a community service learning group. Right now, I connected with the C group, which is called Support Engage. I can't remember the last E. I'll remember that. But there are a lot of, you don't have to do this work alone. There are actually a lot of supports that help you to make connections to the communities that you're teaching in. So that way you can very easily get students to kind of find those connections and offer them ideas as they approach that too. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. The next question perhaps tries to bring together those two worlds that you mentioned, race and place. How do you encourage students from immigrant backgrounds to make connections with a place that's foreign to them or their family histories and experiences?
Yeah, so I resonate with this question myself, as my parents are from Guyana, actually. And that's what I was saying in my land acknowledgement, that there's these very interesting connections to living in Canada, which is a colonial space, because of the colonial ties that exist in the sort of homes that they've left. So I think you have to be very aware that students actually that are from immigrant parents have very grounded colonial ideas as well, in terms of their education and in terms of how they're bringing this work to this space. I think that awareness is very important. I find that you have to build community and foster community in your classroom with these students, because a lot of them are also ingrained to kind of just be like, I'm just here to learn, I'm a vessel and you can just give me the knowledge. And so it's really trying to break those kind of barriers to say, hey, we're actually going to be in a space where there's a reciprocity of learning happening here. So I want you to share some of the ways and traditions and cultural ideas that you want to bring to this space. as much as I'm going to share this work as well. So a lot of they're called active learning strategies because you kind of get them to do group work, to collaborate, to have conversations. And that begins to foster a sense of community, and students eventually start to share. And I notice this every year I have to re-begin. Like every year I start the class and it feels like I'm at the center and they're just waiting to be told information. So every year I have to work through the first 3 weeks, the first 4 weeks, to build that sense of community, and students then start to open up. And I do recognize, as you have mentioned, that there are students from very particular backgrounds that are even more resistant to sharing those sort of ways of knowing, and like, for Indigenous people, sharing traditional ecological knowledge, for instance, in a science classroom, has always been an obstacle, a challenge. Yeah.
This next, it's not a question, just a statement, and speaks to this idea of sharing. I love how this activity allows for community building and increasing social presence. So someone in the audience made that statement regarding your activities that you presented with us today, and ones that we can take on. It's interesting to think about this idea of a shared colonial history. And in some sense, maybe we could consider science as colonized. This next statement and question perhaps speaks to that, perhaps doesn't. Can you reflect on it? They write, I am a science major dropout. I felt disconnected. Studying science felt sterile. If you had a magic wand, how would you change uni-level science curriculum?
I feel like I'm trying to do that now. I teach courses that I've designed, called The Nature of Science, so that students could actually recognize that science is also a socially constructed knowledge as well. They start to begin to recognize that the way even a textbook is designed has very particular power decisions in that space. The kinds of science experiments that are funded has power and privilege structured into what is funded and what is not funded, and how science is communicated to the publics also. So you start to unravel the epistemology of science and recognize how socially constructed science knowledge can be. So I think a university course that dives into the nature of science, which is a course that I do teach, I've called it critical thinking for STEM. I'm thinking about renaming it to something else, but I think that would be a wonderful thing. And also, if I could invite you to, I'm sure you've heard this book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wilkimmer. For a science major dropout, that might rekindle, maybe that early love for science, because she talks about how she had to grapple with being an Indigenous person and having all of these feelings about plants, and then trying to work as a botanist in sort of this sterile science space, and trying to bring those two worlds together. It's a beautiful read, and you can start to see, I think, how the knowledge of science hopefully will change within the years to come in university discourse.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. We have a number of additional questions for you, but have run out of time. And so we're hoping that you might be able to respond to them if you have an opportunity, and we can perhaps post your responses in the future if you do have time on our website.
Sure, yes. Yeah, I'm reading through these.
Thank you. They're amazing questions. They really are. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to introduce the next speaker, but Carrie, if you'd like to segue to that, that would be great.
Absolutely. So just to finish off this section, we have our call to action that we had spoken to at the beginning, where we're really trying to move past this talk. And we really want to take Sheliza's incredible teachings and strategies and everything that she's discussed with us today and move that to action. And sometimes that means a simple conversation with a colleague, with a neighbor, with somebody who is willing to listen and challenge, and so on and so forth. And other ones that we have, compliments of Edith Lando and funding, is the opportunity for people to create lesson plans, workshops, and receive funding from Edith Lando to really create a digital learning resource that extends the amazing work of Dr. Ibrahim. So if you are interested, then you can go to our website, and I'll just pull it up right here, and you could submit a proposal for a call to action. Obviously, this is something that could look very different to different people depending on what your particular line and sector is, but this is where we're going for that. And I'd like to pass it over just to conclude. Dr. Samia, if you can finish up this part.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Next month in the Anti-Racism Seminar Series, we're very excited to welcome visiting scholar Dr. Yun-Son Jung, who comes to us from South Korea, where she is a professor of media education at the Department of Korean Education and the Master's Program in Digital Media Education at Jeongjin National University of Education, South Korea. Her research and practices has focused on children's multiliteracy practices, classroom discourse analysis, and critical understanding of literacy education and remote schooling. She's recently contributed chapters to the Routledge Handbook of Media Education Futures Post-Pandemic, Learning to Live with Datafication, and Learning Beyond the School. And she is currently writing a book together with researchers in 7 different countries about parents and caregivers' experiences on parenting during the COVID-19 pandemic. She will be presenting next month on the topic, Children Learning to Read Digital Data as Text, a case study of critical algorithmic education. Please join us on February 21st, 2023 from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for this incredible presentation. We're going to share the link right now in the chat for you to register for the event, or you can also go to the MET website under the top tab, Anti-Racism.
So to conclude, we want to thank you, Dr. Sheliza Ibrahim, so much. What an incredible presentation. So many ideas, ways to move this forward. Got me thinking of ways that I want to implement this type of work in my own class. So sincerely, thank you so much again for being here. And we will share the recording with everybody on our website, as well as Dr. Ibrahim's article and the questions as well with you. I'll send those to you.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine, truly.
Excellent. And we wish everybody a wonderful evening. Thank you to all of our attendees and those who are going to be watching this session afterwards for joining us. We wish everyone a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.